I remember the day Scarlett joined the agency as vividly as if it were a scene frozen in time. My life had been a carefully orchestrated cycle of early mornings, meticulous lunch breaks, and late nights that never strayed too far from my comfort zone. I was just another person in Los Angeles, waking up to the same alarm, driving the same roads, and sitting at the same desk, feeling like my life was on a perpetual loop. Then Scarlett appeared, and everything changed. No, it wasn't immediate, like lightning striking out of a clear sky. But from the moment our eyes met, I felt an undercurrent of tension that I couldn't explain, and it both thrilled and terrified me. She was the new designer, brilliant, self-assured, the sort of person who commands respect without ever raising her voice. There was an aura around her, something that told you she could walk into any room and shift its entire equilibrium with just a hint of a smile. The rumors about her spread quickly. She had grown up wealthy, had lived in Paris, and turned down jobs at high-profile companies because she considered them too dull. I'd heard it all. But as someone who'd always tried to tune out gossip, I paid little attention to those stories. Or at least, I told myself that. What I couldn't ignore was the way she looked at me during our first team meeting, like she saw all the invisible gears turning in my head. It was as though she already knew me, or at least suspected there was something behind my professional exterior that I had yet to discover. I did my best to avoid her gaze, focusing on the slides in our morning presentation or the notes in front of me. But it was impossible to pretend I didn't feel that presence. There was a silent electricity that crackled whenever we were in the same room. Days turned into weeks, and I fell into a new pattern. I would sense her before I actually saw her. It was subtle. A hush in the air, the hint of perfume, the lightest tap of her heels on the polished floors of the agency. When she finally caught me one evening as I was heading out, my heart leapt in a way that I refused to acknowledge at first. "Hey," she said simply, standing by the glass doors that led out to the parking lot. She wore a gray coat draped effortlessly over her shoulders. "Are you free?" The question was casual enough, but everything about her posture and the intensity of her gaze made it feel like an invitation to step off a cliff. I swallowed hard, forcing a smile in an attempt at composure. Yeah, I said, feeling absurdly caught off guard. "I'm free. Come with me. I want to show you something." Maybe it was the way she said it. Soft, but commanding. Or maybe it was that curious aura that wouldn't let me walk away. Either way, I should have said no. I had a million reasons to go home and stick to my familiar routine, but I said yes. And that one word changed everything. We walked toward the parking garage in silence, the click of her heels echoing against the concrete walls. She led me to a sleek, black car that matched her aura of understated elegance. I slid into the passenger seat, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. She didn't comment, though. Instead, she drove smoothly out of the parking lot, merging into the pulse of Los Angeles traffic. The city at twilight was an endless array of brake lights, neon signs, and a sky that refused to go fully dark. It was that liminal hour when the sun had mostly set, leaving behind a bruise of orange and purple on the horizon, and the city's nightlife began to flicker awake. I stared out the window, trying not to think about the fact that I was alone in a car with a woman I barely knew. She navigated the streets with an ease that spoke of familiarity, eventually guiding the car into a high-rise's underground parking lot. My eyes widened at the private entrance, the tall ceilings, the security guard who greeted her by name. Everything felt surreal, like a dream sequence in a film. We made our way to a private elevator, silent except for the soft hum of its cables. Scarlett glanced at me, leaning casually against the wall of the mirrored interior. "You seem nervous," she noted. I cleared my throat. "I'm not used to this." I wanted to sound confident, but my voice wavered. She gave me a knowing look. "It's just an apartment. You'll be fine." But it wasn't just an apartment. It was a penthouse. And the moment the doors slid open, I felt the breath catch in my throat. Everything was bathed in the faintest glow of recessed lighting that framed the open living space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Los Angeles, with the city lights glittering like scattered jewels against a backdrop of darkness. She led me inside, and I felt an immediate sense of awe. Polished concrete floors, high ceilings, and walls adorned with modern art. A transparent grand piano gleamed in one corner, and an array of vinyl records were neatly stacked near an old-fashioned record player. The contrast between old and new was striking. The building was modern, but the interior held touches of vintage elegance that hinted at her eclectic taste. Then I noticed the glass walls that led out to a massive balcony. She walked straight there, picking up a couple of wine glasses along the way. My heart pounded harder as she opened the sliding door and gestured for me to follow. Stepping onto that balcony felt like walking onto a stage with the entire city as my audience. The night air was cool but not cold, and the glow from the city lights gave the atmosphere an ethereal quality. "It's beautiful," I managed, taking in the view as she handed me a glass of wine. Scarlett leaned against the railing, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Sometimes I come out here just to remind myself that there's more to life than offices and deadlines," she said, sounding almost wistful. "If I didn't, I'd suffocate." I sipped my wine, feeling the warmth of it flood my chest. "I can relate," I admitted. "Office walls have a way of closing in on you." She glanced at me, the corner of her mouth quirking into a half smile. "You can be honest. You know, it's okay to admit you're overwhelmed." I smiled back, although mine held a touch of sheepishness. "Fine, I am overwhelmed, that is." I paused, searching for the right words. "I didn't expect this tonight." She turned fully to face me, studying my expression carefully. "What did you expect? Grabbing a drink in some bar, idle chit-chat about coworkers?" I laughed, a short, nervous laugh. "Basically, yeah, this is a bit different." Scarlett lifted her glass in a small toast. "To different." We clinked our glasses, and I felt something shift inside me, a kind of silent permission to step outside the lines I'd been living within. After a moment of easy conversation, she said, "Come inside. I want to show you something else." We moved back through the large sliding doors into the living area. There was a tension in the air, like the hush before a storm. She led me down a hallway I hadn't even noticed. Most of my attention had been devoured by the grandeur of the main space. Midway, she opened a door to a room that was lit only by a single dim lamp in the corner. Inside were paintings, some propped on easels, others stacked against the walls. Various art supplies were scattered across the floor. Bottles of paint, brushes of all sizes, half-finished canvases that bore bold and expressive strokes. There was an energy there, an immediate sense of rawness that nearly made me shiver. "You paint," I said, though it was obvious. She set her glass down on a cluttered side table. "It's more than painting. It's..." She trailed off, searching for the right word. "It's an exorcism of things I can't put into words." I stepped closer to one of the canvases, drawn by the violent slash of red paint across a dark background. The image was abstract, but it pulsed with emotion. "Why don't you display these? They're incredible." She let out a low chuckle. "Because they're too personal, too revealing." I looked around, noticing that many of the pieces shared that same intensity, like glimpses into her private storms. "I never would have guessed," I said softly, still mesmerized by the art. She came up beside me, and I could feel the warmth of her presence. "You see me at the office, confident, put together, always on top of things. But these paintings, they're a part of me I don't show the world." I turned to face her. "Thank you for sharing them with me." Her gaze dropped momentarily, and in the soft light, she almost looked vulnerable. "I'm not sure why I did, but I wanted you to see them." There was something in her voice that made my stomach flutter. We'd been coworkers who barely knew each other, but standing there in a room filled with her unfiltered emotional expression felt more intimate than any date I'd ever been on. My heart pounded like it was trying to break free from my ribcage, and I struggled to find something to say that wouldn't sound trite. But her eyes, half shadowed by her hair, spoke volumes. And in a shaky moment of self-awareness, I realized we were both teetering on the edge of something we couldn't fully articulate yet. Time blurred as we sat cross-legged on the floor, leaning against a sofa that looked more decorative than functional. Our shoes were off, and we rested our feet on stained drop cloths that were spattered with dried paint in a rainbow of colors. The wine glasses had been refilled, though I'd lost track of how many times. The conversation drifted from the agency, its daily dramas, overbearing deadlines, creative triumphs, to deeper, personal topics. She told me about her years in Paris, a fling with a moody photographer, the nights spent in Montmartre, painting by candlelight when she couldn't afford electricity, the tension with her wealthy parents, who wanted her to settle down into a structured life but paid her rent as long as she stayed out of trouble. The reason she'd left Paris was still hazy, though. She spoke of it in vague terms, alluding to heartbreak and an intense desire to escape. I shared bits of myself that I normally kept under lock and key. My family had never been rich, but we were comfortable. My parents expected certain things of me: stability, a respectable job, nothing too far outside the norm. And so, for a long time, I'd towed the line between compliance and self-erasure. I told her how I'd discovered writing as a teenager, but never pursued it beyond some hobbyist attempts, afraid it wouldn't pay the bills. At some point, she turned to me, an inquisitive light in her eyes. "You said you liked to write." I shrugged, feeling suddenly vulnerable. "I don't just like it. I used to love it, but I haven't done it in a while." She tilted her head. "Why'd you stop?" I hesitated. "The usual reasons: time, fear, feeling like it's not good enough. Life happens, you know." She studied me intently, as if searching for more than just surface answers. "You're afraid to fail?" "Maybe." I looked down at the swirling wine in my glass. Afraid to invest in something that might never pay off. Afraid to expose myself, I guess. She gave a half smile that was both empathetic and sad. "We're all afraid of that. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, though." Her words hung in the air, almost a challenge. The conversation lulled, and we sat in companionable silence, both of us lost in thought. Eventually, I drifted into a semi-meditative state, gazing at a large canvas propped against the wall. It depicted an abstract figure, torso twisted, arms raised, a burst of color where the heart should be. It spoke of longing, maybe even anguish. I was struck by how it felt simultaneously painful and hopeful, like the figure was breaking free from something. "You paint your pain," I said, more to myself than to her. She followed my gaze. "I paint what I need to get out of me. Sometimes it's pain, sometimes it's joy, but mostly, it's everything I'm afraid to say out loud." "That's brave," I said softly. She laughed, but there was no real humor in it. "Or cowardly, because I can only say it with paint." I turned to look at her, searching her face for the woman I'd assumed she was, the polished professional who dominated design briefs at our agency. But I realized that persona was just one facet. Here, in the warm glow of her private art studio, she was someone else entirely. Someone who wore her vulnerabilities on her sleeves, but only when she chose to. And there was an undeniable magnetism in that authenticity. Midnight crept up on us. By the time we noticed the hour, we had emptied another bottle of wine, and the city lights outside had dimmed to a hush. It felt like the rest of Los Angeles was sleeping. Yet here we were, two silhouettes in a half-lit room, the smell of paint and the hum of possibilities. She suggested we move back to the main living area for some fresh air. I agreed, though I felt a pleasant dizziness, partly from the wine, partly from the surge of emotions swirling inside me. We stepped out onto the balcony again, greeted by a gentle breeze that carried the faint sounds of distant traffic. It felt surreal to be so high above the city, a vantage point that made everything else seem small and distant. She leaned over the railing, her hair catching the wind, her features illuminated by the soft glow of the balcony lights. I found myself inching closer, compelled by an inexplicable force. "That painting," I ventured. "The one with the red slash. What were you feeling when you made it?" She exhaled, a slow, measured breath. "It was during a time when everything in my life was changing. I felt trapped, cornered by expectations, and the only outlet was art. That red slash is a scream, I guess?" I stepped even closer, placing a tentative hand on her shoulder. "It's stunning." She turned to me, her eyes flicking down to my hand. A delicate shiver seemed to run through her. "It's nothing like my professional work," she murmured. "Those designs I make at the agency, those are for clients, for paychecks. These paintings, they're for me." The city below us seemed to fade as our gazes locked. The wine had loosened our tongues, yes, but something else was blossoming between us, a mutual recognition of the facets we hid from the world. I swallowed, heart thundering. "Why did you bring me here?" She held my gaze, and for a moment I thought she might not answer, but she did. "Because," she began slowly, "there's something about you that tells me you're searching for more than what you let on. And maybe I saw a piece of myself in you, the part that wants to create, to break free." I felt my cheeks warm, the buzz in my head intensifying. I never told anyone about the writing except in passing. It's been buried under so much stuff. She turned fully to me, and I could almost feel the electricity in the air. "I was hoping maybe tonight would remind you, or remind me, or both." The silence that followed was thick with possibility. I didn't know where this moment would lead, but it felt monumental. Scarlett licked her lips, and the motion caught my attention in a way that made my heart do a strange flip. "I'm going to kiss you," she said, her tone calm but charged with an undercurrent of urgency. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of intent. My eyes widened, and a rush of adrenaline shot through me. I could feel my pulse in my ears. I nodded, just barely. "Then do it," I whispered. She set her empty wine glass on a nearby table, then raised her hand to my cheek, her fingertips warm against my skin. When our lips finally met, it was tentative at first, a gentle exploration that felt like testing the waters. But then the dam broke, and the kiss deepened, swelling with an intensity that made my legs wobble. I gripped the railing to steady myself as I sank into the moment, the taste of wine and something distinctly her melding on my tongue. For that brief span of time, the entire city vanished beneath us. There was only the rhythmic thump of my heart, the heat of her body, the soft breeze that rustled her hair. When we finally broke apart, breathless, she kept her forehead pressed to mine, her eyes fluttering open slowly. "I didn't plan on this," she murmured. I smiled, feeling that same electric hum crackle through my veins. Neither did I. We ended up sprawled on the plush sofa in her living room, the city lights creating shifting patterns across the floor. She'd turned on some soft music, an old jazz record, full of static and nostalgia. We talked in hushed tones, our hands occasionally intertwining, as though we couldn't quite believe we had permission to be so close. She told me about the time she briefly lived in New York, how she'd found the city too cold and impersonal. I told her about my one trip to Europe, how I'd only made it to London for a work conference and wished I could have stayed longer. We swapped stories that seemed more intimate than casual anecdotes, snapshots from the darkest or brightest parts of our lives. A weighty silence settled between us, the kind that begs to be filled with confessions. Finally, she spoke. "Sometimes I paint to remember," she said, her fingers tracing idle patterns on my wrist. "Other times, I paint to forget." I turned my hand so I could lace our fingers together. "Have you ever shown these paintings to anyone else?" I asked. She shook her head, a faint sadness crossing her features. "I've had acquaintances, lovers, friends, but no one I wanted to show these to. Not until..." She hesitated. I swallowed, bracing for what she might say next. "Not until you," she finished softly. 1,000 unspoken questions swirled through my mind. Why me? What did she see in me? Was this just a fleeting connection born of loneliness and too much wine? But instead of voicing those doubts, I squeezed her hand gently. "I'm glad you did," I said, meaning it more than I could properly express. When the night stretched toward dawn, she offered to let me stay. It seemed almost absurd to go home at 4 a.m. after the emotional roller coaster we'd ridden together. She led me to a guest bedroom, tastefully decorated but minimal, with crisp white sheets and a single piece of abstract art on the wall. I slipped beneath the covers, my mind racing with images of the night, the paintings, the cityscape, her lips on mine. Sleep came in fits and starts, my dreams colored by swirling pigments and the subtle scent of her perfume that clung to my clothes. I awoke once to the faint sound of her pacing in the adjacent room, perhaps unable to sleep herself. But eventually, exhaustion won out, and I slipped into unconsciousness fully. Morning light streamed in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, bathing the room in a muted glow. The city below us had transformed from a realm of lights into a sprawling urban landscape. I rubbed my eyes, disoriented for a moment, as I tried to remember where I was. My phone showed a slew of missed notifications, emails, messages, the usual. No urgent calls, though, so I'd apparently missed nothing catastrophic. I slid out of bed, mentally preparing for the awkwardness that might come from facing Scarlett in the daylight. But when I exited the guest room, I was greeted by the smell of fresh coffee and something warm. Croissants, maybe. Sure enough, she was in the kitchen, dressed in an oversized t-shirt and sweatpants, her hair loosely tied back. She looked vastly different from her poised office persona, yet somehow even more alluring. "Morning," she said, offering a small smile as she set down a mug of coffee on the kitchen island. "Morning," I returned, trying not to seem too self-conscious as I padded over to her. She gestured for me to take a seat, then poured a cup of coffee for herself. I woke up early, couldn't sleep, figured I'd make something. I took a sip, the warmth soothing my nerves. "Thank you," I said softly, "for everything. Last night was unexpected." She nodded, her eyes flicking to the windows. That's one way to describe it. We settled into an easy conversation, surprisingly devoid of the awkwardness I'd feared. She mentioned she had no meetings until the afternoon, and I admitted I'd blocked off my morning to work remotely. We joked about emailing our boss to say we were collaborating on a project, which, in a sense, wasn't entirely false. Eventually, though, real life intruded. I needed to go home, shower, and at least pretend to keep up appearances. She walked me to the door, leaning against the frame as I slipped on my shoes. "Last night?" I began, fumbling for words. What does it mean?" She seemed pensive for a moment. "It means there's more to both of us than we let on. And I'd like to see you again." Outside the office, I felt a rush of relief. Me too. With that, I slipped out of her penthouse, the memory of her kiss still fresh in my mind, unsure of what the next chapter of this improbable story would look like. All I knew was that my life had officially taken a turn off the well-worn path I'd been trudging for years. The days that followed felt both exhilarating and daunting. At the agency, we tried to maintain our professionalism. Those stolen glances and fleeting touches in the hallway became a secret language between us. In brainstorming sessions, I found myself scribbling notes about her mannerisms instead of the project at hand. She, meanwhile, continued to deliver stellar designs for our clients, never once letting her personal life interfere with her work. But underneath that polished surface, we both knew something had shifted. The air was charged with an undercurrent of anticipation. We spent more evenings together, sometimes at her place, sometimes at mine. My tiny, cluttered apartment was a stark contrast to her luxurious penthouse, but she never once seemed to judge. She'd lounge on my thrift store couch, flipping through my old notebooks, encouraging me to show her my writing. Gradually, I did. And that was how I discovered the depth of our connection. In the quiet moments, when she'd read a line of my work and look up at me with something akin to pride, I realized I was falling for her. Hard. Yet not everything was smooth. The more time we spent together, the clearer it became that she carried scars deeper than any brushstroke on her canvases could reveal. There were nights she'd close off, refusing to talk about certain topics. The tension with her parents or the abrupt end to her time in Paris. Whenever I tried to gently probe, she'd deflect. I learned not to push too hard, to let her come to me when she was ready. One evening, after a particularly stressful day at work, she invited me over to her penthouse again. She was quiet as I entered, her jaw set in a tight line. "Rough day?" I asked, noticing the shadows under her eyes. She nodded, offering a faint smile. Yeah. Let's talk about it later, okay? I need to unwind." I let her lead me onto the balcony, where we sipped wine in silence. The city below us roared with life, but up there, we were in our own private world. She leaned against me, and I felt the tension radiate off her. "Scarlett," I murmured, wrapping an arm around her waist. "You can talk to me, you know?" She sighed, turning to press her cheek against my shoulder. "I know." But she didn't say more, and I didn't push. Eventually, she rose and walked inside. Without a word, she made her way to her art studio. I followed, a sense of apprehension building in my chest. She flicked on the lights, revealing the swirl of canvases and half-finished work. Something new caught my eye, a large canvas draped in cloth. It was unlike her to cover her work. Usually, she left everything out in the open, not caring if the paint was dry or if the piece was finished. The cloth spoke of secrecy, or maybe shame. She approached it but paused before pulling the cloth away. Her knuckles whitened from gripping the edge too tightly. "You don't have to show me," I said quietly, sensing her hesitation. She closed her eyes. "I want to, but I'm terrified." I took a step closer, heart pounding. "Why?" She exhaled. "Because this is the one painting that's too personal. More personal than everything else you've seen." Before I could respond, she yanked the cloth aside, revealing a chaotic masterpiece. Bold splashes of color intermingled with violent streaks of black. In the center was a figure, half-formed, reaching upwards. The background looked like it was on fire, the oranges and reds clashing with the deeper shadows. My breath caught. It felt like staring into a raw, open wound. "I've never shown anyone this," she whispered, arms wrapped around herself protectively. "I painted it after Paris, after everything fell apart, and I don't know if I can explain it fully. I don't think words will ever do it justice." I felt tears prick at my... I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the sheer force of emotion emanating from the canvas. "Scarlett," I said, my voice thick. "It's incredible." She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her. "It's painful is what it is." Slowly, I turned to her and wrapped my arms around her waist. She trembled, letting out a shaky breath as she leaned her forehead against my shoulder. "It's okay," I whispered, not knowing what else to say. She stayed there for a long time, letting the silence cradle us. I could almost feel the ghosts of her past swirling in the room, weaving into the tapestry of paint and heartbreak. Eventually, she spoke. "I loved someone," she said, voice taut. Back in Paris, it ended horribly. I was broken in a way I never thought possible. This painting, it's everything I felt but couldn't say. The betrayal, the yearning, the regret. She pulled back slightly to look at me, her eyes glistening. I ran away. I came here, took the first job that caught my interest, but I never resolved any of it. Not really. I brushed a strand of hair away from her face. You don't have to run anymore. She closed her eyes, and a tear slid down her cheek. I'm so scared, she admitted, her voice cracking. Of letting anyone in again, of trusting, of losing. I kissed her forehead, heart aching for her. You're allowed to be scared, but you're also allowed to heal. She nodded, burying her face in my neck. We stayed like that, holding each other, the painting towering over us like a silent witness to her pain. And in that moment, I realized that no matter how complicated or risky this was, I wanted to be there for her, to help her find the light in the midst of her darkness. In the weeks that followed, we navigated the delicate dance of a new relationship in a workplace setting. We tried to keep our personal life under wraps, though a few eagle-eyed coworkers noticed the shift in our dynamic. The sly grins, the playful banter. One or two ventured to tease us, but mostly we managed to keep our business our own. Late nights became our sanctuary. We'd find ourselves in her studio or my cluttered living room, each working on our art, she with her painting, me with my writing. Sometimes we barely spoke, content to create side by side, letting the hush of the night and the hum of the city guide us. Those were some of my favorite moments. The quiet intervals where words weren't necessary because we were both lost in a shared sense of purpose. But the aftermath of her past still lingered. It wasn't as though opening up once magically erased her fears. There were times she'd pull away, grow distant, or fixate on a painting in a near-obsessive manner. I tried to be patient, to give her space. We'd talk about it when she was ready, and each time she let me in a little further. As for me, I found myself writing more than I ever had. Poems, short stories, even the beginnings of a novel. Scarlett became my muse, not just in a romantic sense, but in the way she embodied courage mixed with vulnerability. She was teaching me, without ever explicitly saying so, that art is always worth the risk of exposure. Because sometimes, what you fear most, showing the world your rawest self, is the only way to feel truly alive. One Friday night, after a particularly grueling week at work, we made a spontaneous decision to road trip up the coast. She packed a sketchbook, I packed my notebook, and we set off in her car before the sun had even fully set. Traffic was hell, but we laughed and talked and played music to pass the time. Eventually, we reached a quiet stretch of beach near Santa Barbara and checked into a small boutique hotel. It felt like an adventure, just the two of us, away from the city lights, free to exist without the constraints of our daily routines. We walked along the shore, the moon painting a silvery path across the water. Scarlett slipped her hand into mine, weaving our fingers together. The ocean breeze was cool, but her presence was warm beside me. I never really realized how much I needed to get out of the city, I admitted. It's like I can finally breathe. She gazed at the horizon, where the sky merged with the sea in an endless expanse of darkness. I used to come to places like this a lot. Paris didn't have beaches like this, but I'd find quiet spots by the Seine, just to think. Or not think. We walked a little farther, the wet sand sinking beneath our feet. The hush of the waves seemed to echo our unspoken thoughts. Eventually, we sat down, the water lapping inches away from our toes. She turned to me, the moonlight illuminating her. There's something about you, she said softly. You make me feel safe, even when I'm scared of my own thoughts. My heart clenched. I'm just trying to be here for you, I whispered. She nodded, looking out at the vast ocean. You are, and I'm grateful. There, on that moonlit beach, I felt a surge of love so strong it nearly knocked me over. I told her as much. In halting, vulnerable words, she listened, her eyes shining, and then whispered back her own admission of feelings. We kissed, the taste of salt air on our lips, and I felt a swell of hope. The future was uncertain. We both carried baggage, insecurities, and the demands of our professional lives. But in that moment, under the moon's silver gaze, it felt like we had all we needed, each other, the ocean's lullaby, and the spark of creation that bound us together. When we returned to Los Angeles, it was like stepping back into a different reality. The city roared around us, and we stepped onto the stage of our regular lives again. Emails piled up, clients demanded revisions, and deadlines loomed. But this time, it all felt more manageable. Because now, at the end of each day, we knew we had a refuge, whether it was my place or hers, or even the hushed corridors of the agency after hours. Our colleagues began to suspect more than just a friendly camaraderie. Some teased us good-naturedly, others seemed indifferent, but no one called us out directly, and for that, we were relieved. We liked our bubble, the privacy we could maintain. Yet, as time wore on, I sensed a simmering tension in Scarlett. Her parents were coming to visit, and she grew restless at the thought. She confided in me one night that they didn't approve of her career choices, despite financially supporting her. They wanted her in a more respectable position, maybe heading a department in one of the family's companies. And they definitely won't approve of me being with a woman, she added bitterly, pacing back and forth in her living room. I watched her, sympathy tying my stomach in knots. Are you going to tell them? She laughed without humor. Tell them. They'll find out, one way or another. I'm not going to hide you, but I'm also not going to roll out the red carpet for their opinions. I stood up, crossing the space to wrap my arms around her from behind. Whatever happens, I'm here. She leaned her head back against my shoulder, exhaling, I know. The visit was tumultuous, to say the least. Her parents insisted on taking us out to a fancy dinner in Beverly Hills. Scarlett dressed elegantly, her posture rigid, eyes burning with a steely resolve. I wore my best dress, feeling slightly out of place in the lavish restaurant. The conversation was stilted, polite but full of undertones. Her mother asked polite, pointed questions about my background, my family, and my ambitions. Her father, mostly silent, occasionally nodded with a faint frown. By the time dessert arrived, it was painfully clear they disapproved. But they didn't openly chastise Scarlett, perhaps unwilling to cause a scene. Instead, they dropped loaded comments about wondering when she'd return to Paris for a real opportunity, or considering her future and responsibilities. Scarlett seethed, biting her tongue until we were outside. When we finally said goodnight, she pulled me abruptly aside, her face a storm of frustration and embarrassment. God, she hissed. I hate how they can get under my skin. I touched her arm. You're not obligated to appease them. She looked at me, her eyes reflecting a mix of gratitude and sorrow. I know, but they're my family. Family is complicated. I knew that all too well. We stood in the parking lot for a moment, letting the tension of the evening cool. I told her I loved her, and it was the first time I said it so plainly, so deliberately, since that night on the beach. She froze for a fraction of a second, then exhaled, shoulders sagging. I love you too, she whispered, voice trembling. Thank you. From that point on, something solidified between us. Even though her parents returned to their lives, presumably still disapproving, we found a new resolve in each other. The nights of painting and writing continued, but they were now imbued with a sense of hope for our shared future. We talked about moving in together, about traveling, about the possibility of combining our creative talents to start a side project that blended design and storytelling. The tension at work also shifted. Scarlett was offered a major promotion, a chance to lead an entire creative team, with more freedom and bigger responsibilities. She wavered, uncertain if she wanted to tie herself more deeply to a corporate structure. But we talked it through, and eventually, she accepted. She was too talented to play small. And me? I started to consider ways to push my writing out into the world. Perhaps a blog, maybe even seeking publication for some of my short stories. Scarlett's unwavering faith in my work emboldened me in ways I never expected. One evening, long after everyone else had left the office, we stayed behind to finish some urgent pitches. Once we finally wrapped up, we ventured to the rooftop of our building. It wasn't as glamorous as the view from her penthouse, but it offered a different perspective, a vantage point of busy streets and rows of headlights stretching into the distance. I shivered in the cool night air, and she draped her blazer over my shoulders. We stood there, side by side, soaking in the city. Eventually, she turned to me, a thoughtful expression on her face. Remember that first night I brought you to my place? She asked. I laughed softly. How could I forget? She smirked. I didn't think you'd say yes. You looked ready to bolt. I gave her a playful nudge. I'm glad I didn't. We stood in silence for a few moments, the wind picking up. She took my hand, lacing our fingers together. Me too, she said. It changed everything. I leaned my head against her shoulder, heart swelling with gratitude and love. This was the life I never saw coming. The leap of faith that turned my predictable routines upside down. and it was perfect in its messy, complicated way. The question remained in my mind, even as life settled into a new, more vibrant rhythm. Had I fully stepped into my own creative calling? Scarlett's presence had certainly ignited something within me, pushing me to embrace the artistry I'd once let languish. My half-formed novel was now filling pages daily, fueled by late-night writing sessions and the swirl of emotions that living in Los Angeles provided. Scarlett, meanwhile, was painting with a renewed fervor. She'd begun to incorporate elements of typography into her abstracts, lettering that hinted at phrases from my writing. It was like an evolving conversation between our crafts. We'd bounce ideas off each other, laughing at our frustrations and celebrating our tiny victories. And through it all, the undercurrent of our relationship remained fiercely passionate. We had arguments, of course we did, but each conflict forced us to confront our flaws, our insecurities, and to come out stronger on the other side. She opened up more about her past in Paris, about the betrayal that had left her reeling. Ikas, in turn, explored why I'd held back from writing for so long, my paralyzing fear of rejection, and my aversion to stepping out of my comfort zone. We were each other's catalysts, forging a new path that didn't rely on the expectations of others. Months slipped by, and we found ourselves in the holiday season. The office slowed to a more relaxed pace. Clients deferred projects to the new year, and the staff looked forward to breaks and celebrations. Scarlett and I decided to spend Christmas together at her penthouse, partly because she had the space and partly because I wanted to avoid the inevitable questions from my own extended family about when I'd finally settle down and why I was still single. Questions I no longer wanted to answer with half-truths. Decorating her penthouse was an adventure. She'd never bothered with a Christmas tree before, so we picked one out together, a tall, perfectly shaped fir that filled the living room with its piney scent. We strung it with lights and ornaments, many of them handmade or artsy in some way. It was our own patchwork of traditions, old and new. On Christmas Eve, she surprised me with a gift, a small, unassuming black notebook with my initials embossed on the front. "For your writing," she said softly, her gaze hopeful. "I thought you could keep your best ideas in here. Something tangible." Tears pricked at my eyes as I opened it, flipping through the blank pages. "Thank you," I said, voice catching in my throat. She handed me a pen, smiling. "I want you to fill it with stories that you're not afraid to share." I leaned in, kissing her gently. "I will." That night, as the fire crackled and the city spread out below us, we curled up on the sofa. I read aloud some of what I'd written recently, an excerpt about a character who finds love in an unexpected place, reminiscent of our own story. She listened, eyes shining, and when I finished, she set down her wine glass and kissed me with a tenderness that made my heart ache in the best way. The day after Christmas, she asked me to follow her into her studio. To my surprise, a blank canvas sat on the easel, a fresh palette of paints laid out neatly. She turned to me, eyes bright with excitement. "I want us to paint something together," she said, tugging me by the hand. I laughed, a bit nervous. "But I'm not a painter," she shrugged, handing me a brush. "Doesn't matter, I'll guide you." We spent hours there, mixing colors, splattering paint, laughing at my clumsy attempts to mimic her fluid brushstrokes. At first, I was self-conscious about ruining her canvas, but she insisted that there was no right or wrong in art. Slowly, I loosened up, letting the music we played in the background, soft indie rock, guide my movements. By the end, the canvas was a chaotic but vibrant swirl of blues, purples, reds, and golds, with hints of words interspersed, some of which I'd written in pencil first, then painted over. It felt like a living representation of us. Messy, bold, and deeply personal. We stood back, paint smeared and breathless. "It's not perfect," I said, wiping a streak of purple from my cheek. She slipped her arm around my waist, smiling. "It's perfect because it's ours." Looking at that shared painting, I realized how far we'd come from that first night. When I stood on her balcony, stunned by the view, unsure of what I was stepping into. The transformation wasn't just about falling in love. It was about rediscovering parts of ourselves through each other. I found my creative spark again, and she found the courage to confront her past and embrace a more open future. One evening, as we lay together on a blanket spread out on her living room floor, too tired to move to the sofa, she asked me a question that had been lingering beneath our conversations for months. "Do you ever think about what your life would be like if you'd said no that night?" Her head rested on my shoulder, her fingers drawing patterns on my arm. I thought about it. how I'd nearly refused her invitation to leave the office with her, how easily I could have stuck to my comfort zone. Sometimes, I admitted, but it feels unreal, like an alternate universe. She nestled closer. I'm glad you didn't say no. A shiver ran through me, a mix of relief and gratitude. Me too, I whispered. Life continued in its winding way. We faced small challenges at work, snags in new projects, the usual tension of creative fields, but we tackled them together. Our bond strengthened with each shared success and even with each minor failure. We learned to be a team, in private and in public. We argued too, real arguments about silly things, like how I never replaced the toilet paper roll correctly, or how she insisted on reorganizing the silverware drawer by size and shape. But each time, once the frustration subsided, we found ourselves laughing, hugging, and apologizing. We were two distinct people, after all, each with quirks, each with baggage, and that was okay. Yet through every high and low, one fact remained. We had found something we didn't even realize we were missing, a sense of home, not tied to any physical location but to the presence of each other. Then came the day she announced she was considering mounting her first solo exhibition. It was unexpected, given how fiercely private she'd been about her personal art. But something had shifted. She was ready to share more of herself with the world. She even planned to include some of our collaborative piece, if I was okay with it. I was floored. Are you sure? I asked, remembering how she once described these paintings as too personal to display. She nodded, eyes sparkling with a mix of excitement and nerves. I think it's time, and I want you to be part of it. I'll include your texts, your words, woven in. You've inspired me to open up. Maybe it's time I help others see that it's okay to show their scars. I wrapped her in a fierce hug. I'm so proud of you. The night of the exhibition, the gallery bustled with people. Friends, coworkers, collectors, even her parents, who showed up with carefully measured smiles. Scarlett was a vision in a black jumpsuit, hair swept back to reveal the lines of her neck. Her art pieces dominated the space, massive canvases bursting with color and emotion, interspersed with lines of text she'd carefully selected from my writing. People stared, mouths agape, pointing at her bold strokes and the whispered words that spoke of longing, heartbreak, and hope. I heard fragments of praise, awe, even confusion, but that was art. It stirred emotions, whether good or bad. When the night ended, and the last stragglers left, she and I stood alone in the gallery. My heart felt full to bursting as we looked at each other, the echoes of applause still ringing in my ears. You did it, I whispered. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. We did it. We shared a quiet kiss in the empty space, the painting still resonating with the day's energy. It felt like the culmination of a journey, yet also the start of a new chapter. The story of Scarlett and me doesn't end there, of course. Life never wraps up neatly like a movie. But that night in the gallery marked a turning point, a realization that together, we could face whatever lay ahead. I would continue writing, she would continue painting, and we'd keep pushing each other toward new horizons, unafraid of the emotional territory we might unearth. Sometimes, late at night, when we're both too wired to sleep, we revisit the memory of that first evening in her penthouse. The gentle clink of wine glasses, the confession of fears, the surprise kiss. How close we came to never discovering this connection if either one of us had said no or played it safe. It's a humbling thought that entire worlds can bloom or wither based on tiny, seemingly insignificant choices. Now, looking out at the city lights from that same balcony, I hold her hand and reflect on how one impulsive decision changed everything. The risk we took opened doors to a kind of happiness I never knew existed. And even though the future remains uncertain, I face it with a renewed sense of courage, an understanding that life truly begins at the edge of your comfort zone. Because sometimes, the most extraordinary moments happen when you leap without a safety net, when you let desire, curiosity, and a hint of recklessness lead the way. And you? Have you ever experienced something that completely subverted your expectations, but changed everything for the better?